My name is Daniel, and 3 years ago I never would have believed you if you told me I'd end up owning a land surveying company just to win an argument about 6 inches of dirt. But that's exactly what happened. This is the story of how my neighbor's lawsuit over a fence turned into the most expensive mistake she ever made, and how a little patience, a lot of paperwork, and one very good business opportunity taught her a lesson she'll never forget. Let me back up. I bought my house in a quiet suburban neighborhood called Maple Hollow about 6 years ago. It was a modest 3-bedroom place on half an acre, nothing fancy, but it had good bones and a big backyard where I imagined my future kids playing someday. Next door lived a woman named Karen. I'm not using that name to be cute or to make a joke. That was genuinely her name, and if you've watched enough of these stories, you already know the type I'm describing. Mid-50s, retired from some kind of office job, and seemingly employed full-time as the self-appointed guardian of every property line, parking rule, and trash can placement in a 6-block radius. For the first couple of years, Karen and I had a normal, if slightly distant, relationship. We'd wave. She'd occasionally complain about my grass being half an inch too long. I'd occasionally ignore her. Standard neighbor stuff. Nothing that would have made me think, one day, I'd be sitting across from a lawyer discussing property surveys and civil litigation. The trouble started when I decided to replace my old, rotting wooden fence. The fence between our properties had been there since before I moved in. It was falling apart, grey, splintered, leaning in a few places like it had given up on life. I'd been putting off replacing it for years because, frankly, fences are expensive and I had other priorities. But that spring, a storm knocked down 2 sections of it entirely, and I decided enough was enough. I hired a licensed fencing contractor, got the proper permits from the city, and had a brand new cedar fence installed along what I believed, and had every reason to believe, was the exact same line as the old one. I want to be very clear about something here, because it matters a lot for how this story unfolds. I did not guess where the property line was. I did not eyeball it. I pulled out the plat map from my house's paperwork, I looked at the existing fence posts that had been there for decades, and I had my contractor use those same post locations wherever possible. As far as I knew, I was doing everything right. About 2 weeks after the new fence went up, Karen knocked on my door. She was holding a folder. Not a good sign, if you've ever dealt with a Karen. People who show up at your door with a folder are not there to bring you cookies. Daniel, she said, in that particular tone that somehow manages to be both syrupy and threatening at the same time, we need to talk about your fence. I invited her in, my first mistake, in hindsight, though a fairly harmless one, and she sat down at my kitchen table and opened the folder like she was presenting evidence in a courtroom drama. Inside were printouts from an online property mapping tool, the kind where you can look up rough parcel boundaries for free. According to her printouts, my new fence encroached onto her property by what she claimed was at least 2 feet, possibly more. Now, if you know anything about property lines, you know that free online mapping tools are notoriously inaccurate. They're built from tax assessor data that gets updated sporadically, and they can be off by several feet in either direction. They are absolutely not a substitute for a real, licensed survey. I tried to explain this to Karen as gently as I could. I told her the fence was built on the same posts the old fence had used for decades, and that if there was a genuine concern, we should get an actual professional survey done to settle it properly, and I'd be happy to split the cost with her. She didn't want to split the cost. She didn't want a conversation. She wanted, in her words, resolution, and she'd already hired someone to give it to her. Before it got to that point, I actually tried a few more times to smooth things over. I left a voicemail. I sent a polite email with photos of the old fence posts alongside the new ones, hoping visual proof would settle her mind. I even offered to pay for half of a proper survey myself, which is not something you do when you think you're in the wrong. Karen never responded to any of it. Later, during discovery, I learned she had already met with a lawyer the same week she first knocked on my door, which explained a lot about why none of my attempts at a reasonable conversation ever seemed to land. She wasn't looking for a resolution. She had already decided how this was going to go. 2 weeks later, I was served with a lawsuit. I remember standing in my driveway holding the papers, genuinely stunned. Karen was suing me for trespass, for the cost of having to hire a surveyor to protect her property rights, and for something called diminution of property value, which her filing claimed was in the thousands of dollars because my fence had supposedly reduced her usable yard space. She was asking me to tear down the fence, pay for a new one on what she claimed was the correct line, and cover her legal fees on top of it. I'll admit, my first reaction was panic. Nobody wants to be sued, especially not over something as small and stupid as a fence. But once the panic wore off, it was replaced by something more useful: stubbornness. I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. I had built that fence in good faith, on posts that had stood in that spot for longer than I'd owned the house, and I wasn't going to just roll over because Karen had decided to escalate a neighborly disagreement into a courtroom battle. So I did what anyone in my position should do. I hired a lawyer. Her name was Priya, and she came recommended by a friend who dealt with a similar property dispute a few years back. Priya's first move was smart and simple. She requested a copy of the survey Karen's lawsuit was based on. Not the free online map printouts, an actual, official land survey, since Karen's complaint referenced one being commissioned. That's when things got interesting. The survey had been done by a small local company called Redline Surveying Associates. I'd never heard of them before, but apparently they were fairly active in our county, doing surveys for property disputes, refinances, and new construction. Priya pulled the survey documents during discovery, and something about them struck her as off almost immediately. "This survey has some irregularities," she told me during one of our meetings. "The benchmark reference points don't match county records from the last official survey of this parcel, which was done back when the subdivision was originally platted. And there's a 2-degree deviation in the bearing angle on the northern boundary that doesn't line up with anything on file." In plain English, the survey Karen paid for and was using as the entire basis of her lawsuit against me appeared to be wrong. Now, I want to pause here and say something important, because this story isn't really about me being angry at a surveying company. It's about what happens next, and I think it's worth understanding the full picture before I get there. Surveying is a precise, technical profession, and small errors can absolutely happen even at reputable firms: a misread benchmark, an outdated reference point, a rushed field visit. Mistakes happen in every industry. What made this situation different was what we discovered as we kept digging. Priya hired an independent, board-certified surveyor to conduct a completely new, official survey of both properties. This wasn't cheap. It cost me a few $1,000s out of pocket, but it was necessary if I wanted real evidence to defend myself in court. The independent surveyor spent the better part of 2 days out on our properties with equipment, checking historical monuments, cross-referencing county plat records going back decades, and doing the kind of careful, methodical work that a rush job simply doesn't allow for. The result: my fence was not encroaching on Karen's property at all. In fact, according to the new, independent survey, my fence was sitting almost exactly on the historical boundary line, the same line the old fence had occupied for probably 40 years. If anything, my fence was a few inches on my side of the actual line, not hers. Redline Surveying Associates had gotten it wrong. When Priya presented this new survey as evidence, along with a formal report explaining the discrepancies, I genuinely thought that would be the end of it. Karen would see the professional, court-admissible evidence, realize she'd wasted money on a flawed report, and drop the whole thing. That's what a reasonable person would do. Karen was not, it turned out, a reasonable person. Instead of backing down, she doubled down. She insisted that our independent surveyor must have made a mistake, or worse, that I had somehow paid him off to produce a favorable result, an accusation that was not only false but genuinely offensive to a licensed professional's integrity. She refused to drop the lawsuit and instead had her own lawyer request a third survey, this time from yet another company, hoping for a result that matched her original claim. The third survey, unsurprisingly, confirmed exactly what our independent surveyor had found. My fence was on the correct line. I'll admit there was a small, petty part of me that enjoyed watching her spend more money trying to prove me wrong than it would have cost her to simply accept the first correction. But mostly, I just felt tired. Litigation has a way of draining you that's hard to explain unless you've been through it. It's not just the money, though the money is real and it adds up fast. It's the way it sits in the back of your mind during dinner, during work meetings, during quiet moments when you're supposed to be relaxing. Priya kept reminding me that the facts were on my side, and she was right. But facts don't stop the anxiety of waiting for the next court date to show up in your mailbox. At this point, you'd think the lawsuit would have collapsed completely. And legally speaking, it should have. But Karen's lawyer, who I later learned was being paid an enormous amount for what was becoming an increasingly unwinnable case, kept finding small procedural things to argue about, dragging the case out for months. Motions were filed. Hearings were scheduled and rescheduled. My legal fees kept climbing. I want to be honest with you. There were nights during that stretch where I genuinely considered just giving up, tearing down a perfectly legal fence, and rebuilding it a foot onto my own property just to make the whole nightmare go away. Sometimes the cheapest option isn't winning. It's just making the headache stop. But something kept me going, and it wasn't stubbornness anymore. It was curiosity. I kept thinking about that first survey. The one from Redline Surveying Associates that started this entire mess. How does a licensed, professional surveying company get something that wrong? And more importantly, was this a one-time mistake, or was it a pattern? So during one of the long stretches of waiting for court dates, I started doing some digging of my own. I pulled public records on Redline Surveying Associates. I looked into complaints filed with the state licensing board. I talked to a few other homeowners in the county who'd used their services over the past several years, some of whom I found through local community forums and neighborhood groups. What I found was eye-opening. Redline wasn't a scam operation or anything dramatic like that, but it was a company that had grown too fast, taken on too many clients, and cut corners to keep up. Several other property owners described experiences almost identical to mine: rushed field visits, inconsistencies with historical records, and surveys that didn't hold up when independently verified. The company had a handful of formal complaints on file with the state board, though nothing that had yet resulted in serious disciplinary action. And here's the thing that really caught my attention. The company was privately owned by a semi-retired founder who, according to public business filings, had been quietly looking to sell for the past year or so. He'd built the business decades ago, but between rising insurance costs, staffing shortages, and his own desire to finally retire for real, Redline was, in plain terms, a company for sale. I actually met the founder once before I ever thought about buying his company, though I didn't realize it at the time. Priya had subpoenaed him for a deposition regarding the survey his company produced, and I sat in on part of it as the plaintiff's target, watching this tired, soft-spoken man in his early 70s try to explain, honestly and without much defensiveness, how a company he'd spent 30 years building had let a client down. He wasn't hostile. He wasn't dismissive. He seemed genuinely embarrassed, and at one point he said something that stuck with me, that he'd built the business on a promise of accuracy, and lately he felt like he was spending more time apologizing for mistakes than standing behind good work. I didn't know it yet, but that deposition planted the first seed of an idea that would take root a few months later. I remember sitting with that information for a few days, turning an idea over in my head that felt almost too absurd to take seriously. But the more I thought about it, the more it made a strange kind of sense. I had some savings. I had some equity in my house. I had a background, this part one haven't mentioned yet, in operations and small business management from years working for a regional construction firm before I went out on my own as a consultant. I understood contracts, staffing, and how to run a service-based business, even if surveying itself wasn't my technical specialty. And I knew that if I owned this company, I would have complete, direct access to every record, every field note, every historical file connected to my own property dispute, along with the ability to make sure it never happened to anyone else the way it had happened to me. So I made a decision that surprised even myself. I reached out to the founder of Redline Surveying Associates, expressed serious interest in acquiring the business, and began the process of due diligence. It took a few months to put together. I brought in a business broker to properly value the company, had an accountant review their books, and worked with a lawyer, a different one from Priya, since this was now a business transaction rather than litigation, to structure the purchase. In the end, I acquired majority ownership of Redline Surveying Associates for a price that, while significant, was within reach given the equity I had available and a business loan I qualified for based on the company's existing client base and revenue. The first thing I did as the new owner, even before the ink was fully dry, was request the complete internal file on the survey performed for Karen's property. What I found explained everything. The survey had been conducted by a field technician who, it turned out, had been let go from the company about a month after completing Karen's job, not because of that specific survey, but as part of a broader pattern of rushed, sloppy work that management had only started taking seriously after several client complaints piled up. His notes on Karen's property showed he had used an outdated benchmark reference instead of the updated county monument that had been installed years earlier during a road resurfacing project nearby. It was a real, documented, and completely explainable error. Not fraud, not malice, just poor quality work that should have been caught during a proper internal review and wasn't. I brought this documentation to Priya immediately. With direct access to the original field notes, the technician's error clearly documented, and 2 independent surveys confirming the correct boundary, the case against me was no longer just weak, it was completely dismantled. Priya filed a motion for summary judgment, laying out the full timeline, the original flawed survey, the documented internal error behind it, and the 2 subsequent independent surveys that both confirmed my fence was correctly placed. The judge granted the motion. The lawsuit was dismissed. I remember sitting in the courtroom when the ruling came down, half expecting to feel a rush of triumph, some big cathartic moment like you'd see in a movie. Instead, what I felt was mostly quiet relief, the kind that settles into your shoulders slowly rather than hitting you all at once. Priya shook my hand in the hallway afterward and told me, half joking, that in 15 years of practicing law she'd never had a client end a property dispute by acquiring the surveying company at the center of it. I told her I hadn't exactly planned it that way either. It just made sense once I saw the opportunity clearly. Karen was ordered to cover a portion of my legal fees, given how clearly unfounded the claim had become once real evidence was on the table, though not the full amount. Legal proceedings rarely work out that cleanly. Still, after everything, it felt like enormous relief. Not vindication exactly, more like finally being able to exhale after holding my breath for the better part of a year. I'd love to tell you Karen came over afterward, apologized, and we shared a nice cup of coffee while laughing about the whole misunderstanding. That's not what happened. In reality, she avoided eye contact with me for months afterward, and our relationship settled into a cold, distant politeness that has basically defined our interactions ever since. We wave. We don't talk. And honestly, at this point, that's completely fine with me. But here's where the story takes a turn I genuinely didn't expect when I first bought that surveying company out of what was honestly a mix of curiosity and spite. Running Redline turned out to be something I was actually good at, and more than that, something I found genuinely rewarding. I brought in a licensed professional surveyor as operations manager to oversee all technical work, since I am absolutely not a surveyor myself and never pretended to be. I focused on what I knew, cleaning up the business side. We implemented a mandatory second review process for every survey before it goes out to a client, something that hadn't existed before. We invested in updated equipment and better training. We addressed the outstanding complaints with the state licensing board, working directly with regulators to show the corrective steps we'd taken, and over time, our reputation in the county actually improved. 2 years later, Redline Surveying Associates is a completely different company than the one that made that costly mistake on Karen's property. We've grown our client base, our online reviews have gone from mediocre to genuinely strong, and we've become one of the more trusted names for property surveys in the region, precisely because we built our new process around the kind of failure that started this whole story. We also started something the old ownership never had, a straightforward policy for handling client disputes before they ever reach the point of a lawsuit. If a homeowner questions one of our surveys, we now offer a free internal review within 2 weeks, conducted by a different surveyor than the one who did the original work, with a written explanation of the findings either way. It's a small thing, but I think about how differently my own situation might have gone if that policy had existed a few years earlier. Maybe Karen and I never end up in a courtroom at all. Maybe we just get an honest answer a lot sooner, and I never learn the first thing about running a surveying business. Funny how that works out sometimes. The old founder, by the way, still stops by the office every couple of months, mostly out of habit more than anything else. He's fully retired now, spends his time fishing and visiting grandchildren, but he likes to see how the place is doing. Last time he visited, he told me the company felt more like the one he'd originally set out to build decades ago, back before the workload got away from him. I told him that meant more to me than he probably realized, and I think I meant it more than I expected to when the words came out. Sometimes I think about how strange it is that a fence dispute with a difficult neighbor led me into an entirely new chapter of my professional life, one I never would have chosen on my own. If Karen hadn't sued me, if that first survey had never been flawed, I'd probably still just be a homeowner with a nice cedar fence and no idea that land surveying businesses even existed as something a regular person could own and run. I don't regret how any of it played out, even the stressful parts, maybe especially the stressful parts, because they're the reason I ended up learning something new about running a business and making sure other homeowners don't go through what I went through. There's a particular kind of satisfaction in taking something that was genuinely one of the worst years of my life and turning it into something productive, something that actually helps people now instead of hurting them. As for the fence itself, it's still standing exactly where it was built, cedar boards weathering nicely into a soft silver grey, sitting precisely on the line where 2 independent surveys and my own company's corrected records all agree it belongs. Every so often I look out at it from my back porch and think about just how far a simple home improvement project managed to take me. Karen still lives next door. We still don't really speak beyond the occasional wave. But every time I drive past her house, I can't help but notice her fence is in remarkably good shape too. A fence, I happen to know for a fact, that was surveyed and verified using records from a company she probably still doesn't realize I now own. Some property lines take a little longer to settle than others. Mine took a lawsuit, 3 surveys, one very stubborn neighbor, and an entirely unplanned career pivot. But in the end, the line held exactly where it was always supposed to be. And that, for anyone wondering, is how a fence, a folder full of bad printouts, and a neighbor named Karen turned me into the accidental owner of a land surveying company, and taught me that sometimes the best way to win an argument isn't to fight harder. It's to understand the problem better than anyone else in the room. Thanks for listening to my story. If you've ever had a neighbor dispute that spiraled into something completely unexpected, I'd genuinely love to hear about it. And if you enjoyed this one, there are plenty more stories like it coming.